Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. As always, viewer discretion is advised. May 2, 1986. Three seasoned spelunkers stood at the mouth of Goliath's Cave, southeastern Minnesota. Quiet around them, spring air cool against limestone. Greg Heidman, Mike Lilia, Jim, Magnus, not thrill seekers, not reckless amateurs. They were part of a careful, methodical effort to solve a problem that had frustrated their community for years. Goliath's Cave was a maze system, intricate, water-cut, threaded with a stubborn stream that dictated when humans were allowed inside. The main entrance was a punishing 200-foot crawl, roughly 61 meters of claustrophobic limestone that flooded regularly. When it sumped, it didn't negotiate. It sealed. For months at a time, exploration simply stopped. The goal was practical: create a second entrance. Bypass the flooded crawl entirely. But to coordinate a dig from the surface, they first needed a precise underground survey. And to survey, they needed access. By mid-March, the entrance had completely sumped, two separate water barriers divided by 15 feet of passage. Not one obstacle, but two. The plan they developed reflected experience. Pump the first sump Friday night. Let the cave breathe overnight. Return Saturday morning. Pump the second sump. Then survey. Careful, staged, respectful of risk. They selected a gasoline-powered pump, strong enough to handle the stream flow. Ventilation, they believed, would be sufficient. A narrow side passage, too tight for a person, fed fresh air past the sump into the main cave. When the entrance flooded, that airflow increased. On paper, it was a workable system. At 8:30 p.m., they carried the pump through darkness to the first sump. The cave was, indeed, drawing air, a noticeable breeze, encouraging. They positioned the pump about 20 feet from the water's edge. Intake hose secured, fuel primed, engine started. The roar shattered the stillness. In a cave, sound doesn't fade, it rebounds. The gasoline engine thundered against stone, echo stacking upon echo. Exhaust bloomed instantly in the confined passage. Sharp, oily, heavy. They estimated the sump held no more than 3,000 gallons. 15 minutes of pumping. Quick work. But underground, time stretches, and air behaves differently than it does in open fields. Moments after starting the pump, they realized the discharge hose had kinked. Water wasn't flowing correctly. They moved to fix it, stepping toward the junction where the side passage fed in fresh air. They chose that spot deliberately, positioning themselves where airflow felt strongest. They were thinking about ventilation. They were not thinking about carbon monoxide. Gasoline engines don't just produce smell. They produce an invisible, odorless gas that binds to hemoglobin more aggressively than oxygen ever can. In open air, it disperses. In confined limestone corridors, it cools. The breeze they trusted was real, but airflow in caves is complex, directional, layered. Exhaust can circulate in ways that feel counterintuitive. Fresh air can pass overhead while heavier exhaust eddies at breathing level. A side passage can ventilate one section while another becomes a trap. They were focused on the hose. Focused on the immediate mechanical problem. 15 minutes is not long. But in a confined underground space with a gasoline engine running, 15 minutes can be everything. The pump roared on, and the cave, indifferent and patient, began to fill with something none of them could see. Before leaving, they wanted to confirm the pump was still working properly. It had been running close to 10 minutes now. Long enough for exhaust to accumulate. Long enough for the air to change. Mike Lilia volunteered to crawl back and check it. A simple task. A minute, maybe two. But the airflow they had trusted was deceptive. The narrow side passage was indeed pulling air inward, but that meant the entrance crawl, where the pump sat roaring, had become a pocket. Exhaust was no longer dispersing. It was concentrating. Carbon monoxide was building. Colorless, odorless, tasteless. It does not announce itself. It does not burn your lungs. It does not sting your eyes. The first warning is subtle. A mild headache, light dizziness, a strange fog creeping into thought. By the time you understand what is happening, your blood is already saturated with poison. Oxygen has been displaced. Judgment slips away. First, then strength, then consciousness. Greg Heidman waited at the junction where fresh air flowed. He counted to 15 before leaning around the corner to check on Lilia. What he saw chilled him. Lilia was near the pump at the water's edge, squatting oddly, movements sluggish and wrong. Not mechanical, not purposeful, wrong. Heidman crawled toward him as Lilia began crawling back. The fact that he was moving at all offered a thin thread of hope, but instinct was louder than comfort. Something was terribly off. Heidman reached the pump and killed it immediately. The engine sputtered and died. The echo faded. Silence rushed in. He asked if Lilia was okay. Yes, Lilia answered, then added, almost casually, we should leave. I have a headache. Quote, in a confined cave with a gasoline engine running, headache means one thing. Carbon monoxide. Before the implication could fully register, Lilia dropped to his knees. The shift was instantaneous. Concerning became critical. The pump was off, but the air was already poisoned. The crawlspace held the exhaust like a sealed chamber. Every breath they drew was replacing oxygen with something that would not sustain life. Heidman grabbed him, shook him, told him they had to move, now. Fresh air was only a short crawl away, close in distance, infinite in effort. I can't make it, Lilia said. And then Heidman felt it too. A wave, sudden, crushing. His limbs weakened, his thoughts blurred at the edges. The carbon monoxide was binding to his hemoglobin, locking oxygen out, suffocating him from within. His muscles refused commands. His brain struggled to process. It was around 11:15 p.m. He tried to drag Lilia, but his strength evaporated almost immediately. Each pull felt like lifting stone. He could barely move his own body. The reality crystallized in seconds. Stay, and both of them would die. Leave, and there was a chance. A narrow, brutal chance. Heidman chose survival. He turned toward the entrance and began crawling. Behind him, his friend lay in the dark. As he moved, his body screamed for rest. An overwhelming urge to stop. To lie down. To close his eyes, just for a second. Carbon monoxide poisoning seduces its victims with sleep. It feels like relief, like surrendering to comfort. But somewhere beneath the fog, something older and stronger took control. He did not stop, not once. 15 minutes after abandoning the darkness, Greg Heidman stumbled into the surface camp where Jim Magnus waited. He was barely coherent. Words came in fragments. His movements were unsteady. His skin carried the pallor of someone who had brushed against death and not yet understood how close it had come. But he was clear about one thing. He would not go back. He begged Magnus not to go either. Whatever had happened down there, whatever invisible force had wrapped around his lungs and stolen his strength, it had carved terror into him so deeply that the thought of re-entering that crawl was unbearable. Magnus listened, and then he faced the reality Heidman could not. Mike Lilia was still inside. Alive, maybe. Dying. Almost certainly. Magnus knew he could not pull him out alone. Not through a flooded crawl thick with lingering exhaust. Not without air support. Not without help. He ran to his vehicle and drove through the night to the home of Steve Landsteiner, the nearest experienced caver in the area. Every minute mattered now. Landsteiner understood immediately. He grabbed an oxygen tank from a welding rig. Improvised, heavy, but powerful, and the two men raced back toward Goliath's cave. At 11:58 p.m., they left the oxygen cylinder at the lip of the sinkhole entrance and crawled underground. The pump had been silent for 45 minutes. But silence does not mean safety. Carbon monoxide lingers. It settles. It waits. They reached Lilia at 12:14 a.m. The sight stopped them cold. He lay face down in the water at the edge of the sump. Still breathing. Barely. Each breath made a wet, gurgling sound, the unmistakable sound of water in the lungs. He had collapsed unconscious from carbon monoxide poisoning and had been lying in the sump for nearly an hour, slowly drowning while his blood starved for oxygen. There is a particular horror in that realization, that death was coming from two directions at once. Landsteiner turned and crawled out immediately to retrieve the oxygen tank. He found Heidman, who had recovered enough to assist, and together they hauled the heavy cylinder back through the crawl. They held the hose over Lilia's nose and mouth, forcing pure oxygen into him, trying to displace the carbon monoxide that had hijacked his bloodstream. But oxygen alone would not save him. They had to move him. They exited again, moving with desperate purpose, and built a makeshift drag stretcher from a tarp and poles. Improvised rescue in the dark. No guarantees, only urgency. Time was thinning. Lilia had been unconscious for over an hour. His body temperature was dropping rapidly in the cold cave water. His lungs were filling. His blood was poisoned. Every second carried him closer to a point beyond return. At approximately 12:50 a.m., they returned with the stretcher and began the agonizing extraction. The entrance crawl was long and tight. Every inch required effort. Drag, shift, breathe, drag, again. There are no heroic sprints in cave rescues. Only inches earned through exhaustion. Finally, around 1:45 a.m., they pulled him from the mouth of the cave. But the ordeal was not finished. The entrance lay at the bottom of a 40-foot sinkhole, roughly 12 meters of vertical earth. That stood between Lilia and real medical care. They needed more hands. At 2:25 a.m., they returned with enough people to rig a hull system and lift his limp body up the vertical wall to level ground. From there, they rushed him to the emergency room in Cresco, Iowa. Doctors were stunned by what they saw. His core body temperature was 81 degrees Fahrenheit, severe hypothermia. He had been lying in cold water long enough for his body to begin shutting itself down. His lungs contained water from aspiration, and most critically, his blood oxygen level was catastrophically low. Carbon monoxide had bound to his red blood cells with ruthless efficiency. Hemoglobin, meant to carry life-giving oxygen, had been hijacked. His body was suffocating from within, even as he lay on a hospital bed surrounded by air. The local hospital staff worked frantically, but they did not have what he needed. Without advanced respiratory support, without the equipment to force oxygen into poisoned blood and outcompete the carbon monoxide, they could not reverse the damage quickly enough. The decision came swiftly. He would be airlifted. An emergency helicopter was summoned to transport Mike Lilia to the Mayo Clinic, one of the few facilities equipped to treat severe carbon monoxide poisoning with the urgency and technology required. The night was not over. But hope, thin and fragile, was still alive. The cave did not care about enthusiasm. Its passages opened wide and then narrowed without warning, shifting from chambers where voices echoed into crawls that pressed chest and stone together until breath felt borrowed. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, turning solid rock into slick betrayal. Other surfaces were jagged, sharp enough to slice skin with a careless brush. Every movement required deliberate attention, a hand placed here, a boot tested there. Caves reward patience. They punish distraction. Before the first group even reached the Z-bends, reality had already dismantled optimism. 4 Conservancy members discovered, with growing dread, that caves were not adventurous playgrounds. They were cold. They were airless. They were claustrophobic in a way that made your ribs feel too tight around your lungs. These 4 decided they were done. Experienced cavers had to peel away from the main party to escort them back to the surface. That decision, splitting supervision, quietly weakened the structure holding the rest together. Bill Franks was one of the 4 who had seen enough. He did not want exploration. He wanted daylight. Chuck House guided him upward from the flat room toward the big room, navigating the steep, slanted incline that connected the chambers. It was a section that demanded careful foot placement and steady hands. The rock there was angled just enough that gravity always waited for a mistake. Franks was exhausted. His nerves were frayed. His thoughts were already outside the cave. That is how accidents begin. Not with recklessness, but with misplaced attention. His foot slipped. It happened in silence and then all at once. The initial drop was only 6 feet, but the slope beneath turned the fall into momentum. He struck, rolled, and gathered speed, tumbling 15 feet down the incline. Stone met bone. Boots scraped uselessly for purchase. His hard hat flew off immediately. Without a chin strap, it had been nothing more than decoration. His unprotected head struck rock with a sound that froze the chamber, a crack that echoed against limestone walls. Blood followed instantly. Scalp wounds bleed dramatically, turning small lacerations into terrifying spectacles. Chuck House scrambled down toward him, heart hammering. In caves, head injuries are not inconveniences. They are potential tragedies. There are no ambulances waiting at the entrance. No quick access to scans or surgical teams. House's hands trembled as he checked for signs of fracture, unequal pupils, confusion. Anything that hinted at deeper trauma. By luck more than design, the injury appeared superficial. A scalp cut, painful, bloody, but not catastrophic. Pressure slowed the bleeding. Franks, pale and shaken, was helped to his feet. He walked, out under his own power, destined for stitches in a story that would grow more dramatic. Each time it was told, the first accident ended in relief. The cave was not finished. The second group, led by experienced member Alan Paget, had navigated the Z-bends and was moving toward the big room. He was attempting the near-impossible task of supervising 14 novices in an environment that punishes divided attention. 14 pairs of boots, 14 different fear thresholds, 14 opportunities for error. Robert Boone was struggling more than most. He was a large man, and the tight crawls had demanded more from him than from others. Each squeeze through narrow passage had been a negotiation between stone and body. Claustrophobia had pressed in, whispering that the ceiling might come lower still. By the time they began ascending toward the big room, he was physically and mentally depleted. Fatigue does not announce itself with fanfare. It erodes judgment quietly. Paget moved up and down the line, offering guidance, spotting hand placements, reminding people where to step. But no leader can occupy every blind spot. The incline ahead, the same treacherous slope Franks had fallen on, waited in patient silence. And in caves, repetition does not reduce danger. It doubles it. Every climb had drained him. Not dramatically, not in some cinematic collapse. Just quietly, muscle by muscle, breath by breath. Robert Boone was running on fumes by the time he reached the slope into the big room. His forearms trembled from earlier crawls. His legs felt heavier than they should have. Fatigue and frustration had braided together into carelessness. He stepped. His foot slipped. His hands searched for rock that wasn't there. And gravity took him. Like Bill Franks before him, his hard hat flew off the moment he began to fall. Without a chin strap, it offered protection only in theory. The helmet bounced uselessly down the incline. As Boone's body followed, striking, twisting, accelerating. At the bottom, he hit hard against a cluster of rocks. His unprotected head slammed into stone with sickening force. This time the sound was different. Not a crack of surprise, but the dull, final thud of impact. Boone went limp instantly. No attempt to brace. No scramble to recover. His body collapsed into stillness like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Alan Paget saw it all. The distance between leader and disaster vanished in seconds. He scrambled down the slope, heart pounding in his throat. When he reached Boone, the scene confirmed his worst fear. Unconscious. Blood flowing freely from a torn scalp. Breathing ragged. Irregular. Strained. Wrong. That breathing frightened him most of all. Irregular respiration in a head injury can mean the brain itself has been shaken, bruised, or worse. Training overrode panic. Paget rolled Boone onto his back, stabilized his head as best he could, cleared his airway. Swept away any obstruction that might choke him. Slowly, the breathing steadied, not normal, but less chaotic. He pressed cloth to the scalp wound to control the bleeding. He checked his watch. 3:56 p.m. Time suddenly had weight. Orders were given quickly and clearly. One member ran for the first aid kit. Another began the long, urgent journey to the surface to organize rescue. This was no longer an educational conservancy outing. This was a life suspended in limestone. Paget stayed with Boone, monitoring every breath, every twitch, listening for changes in rhythm. Minutes stretched into something elastic and distorted. Then, movement. Boone's eyelids fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused, drifting. He looked through people before he looked at them. The bleeding slowed under steady pressure. They moved him carefully to a smoother patch of ground, every shift done with caution in case his spine had been compromised. Hypothermia now joined the list of enemies. Caves hold their temperature with merciless consistency. Cold stone pulls warmth from injured bodies faster than people realize. Extra clothing was stuffed beneath him for insulation. A space blanket was wrapped tight. Someone fashioned a crude warming shelter from a garbage bag and a candle, creating a fragile bubble of warmer air around him. The tiny flame flickered against stone walls, a small defiance against an environment that does not negotiate. These were simple wilderness techniques. In a cave, they are the difference between stabilization and decline. Boone was conscious, but altered. He could say his name. He could not say the date. Confusion settled over him like fog, a textbook sign of concussion or worse. When asked simple orientation questions, his answers drifted sideways. Then he said his hands were going to sleep. Quote, numbness. That word landed heavily, and then came the sentence that tightened every chest around him. My back hurts. Quote, back pain after a fall like that is not a complaint. It is a warning. In caves, spinal injuries are logistical nightmares. There are no stretchers that glide easily through tight crawls, no flat hallways, no straight line evacuation, just slopes, squeezes, and vertical sections that must be negotiated inch by inch. Paget understood what this might mean. This wasn't just a head injury. It might be a spinal trauma deep underground, with daylight hours away and a rescue that would take coordination, manpower, and precision. The cave had taken a careless step and multiplied it into crisis. And now the clock was running. Paget didn't need a medical degree to understand what back pain after a fall could mean. Spinal injury. And in a cave, a spinal injury is not just a medical emergency, it is a logistical nightmare. Carved in stone. When the first aid kit finally arrived, they worked with steady hands. The scalp wound was cleaned and dressed properly, pressure bandages secured. Boone was kept as still as possible. No unnecessary movement, no shifting without coordination, every adjustment deliberate. The remaining conservancy members were quietly escorted out of the cave. No drama, no raised voices, just the slow realization that the educational outing had become something else entirely. On the surface, word had already spread. Professional cave rescue in 1984 was not casual. It required trained personnel, specialized equipment, coordination, and time. 18 rescuers assembled and entered the cave, carrying a sked stretcher, a flexible rescue litter designed specifically for sea-on-find environments where rigid stretchers simply won't pass. Getting Boone out would not be quick. The stretcher had to snake through tight passages, bend around rock projections, and be angled through sections that were never designed for evacuation. At steep climbs, rescuers rigged hull systems, ropes threaded through pulleys, mechanical advantage built carefully so that upward movement could be controlled inch by inch. Every lift was calculated, every repositioning coordinated. No sudden jolts, no twisting of the spine. The climb-up section was the most delicate. The stretcher and its human cargo were raised slowly, rescuers above hauling in rhythm while those below stabilized and guided, hands steady on rope and rock. Hours passed in controlled, exhausting effort. Finally, at 7:30 p.m., nearly 4 hours after the fall, Robert Boone was carried out of Petty John's cave and placed into an ambulance. Only then did the full medical picture emerge. Scalp laceration, multiple contusions, and most serious, a cracked vertebra in his spine. The back pain he had mentioned in that dim chamber was not soreness. It was a fracture in his spinal column, a few inches difference in impact, a slightly different landing angle, and the outcome could have been paralysis, or worse. Later, in his incident report, Alan Paget did not soften the truth. The trip had been catastrophically poorly planned. Helmets without chin straps were not protective equipment, they were props. They gave beginners the illusion of safety while failing at the exact moment protection mattered most. Both injured men had lost their helmets instantly during their falls. Handheld lights had forced climbers to sacrifice stability for visibility. You cannot safely climb steep rock while dedicating one hand to holding a flashlight. And perhaps most critically, the ratio of experienced cavers to novices had been dangerously inadequate. One person cannot safely supervise 14 inexperienced. Individuals in a cave system with vertical slopes and technical sections. Paddock recommended what should have been obvious from the start. Helmets with secured chin straps. Helmet-mounted lights. A strict ratio of 1 experienced caver for every 3 to 4 novices. These were not advanced protocols. They were fundamentals. The Georgia Nature Conservancy trip had violated nearly every principle of safe cave leadership. And the irony was sharp. Paddock had handled the emergency flawlessly. Calm. Assessment. Airway management. Hypothermia prevention. Rescue coordination. He had done everything right once disaster struck. But he never should have been placed in that position to begin with. The real failure had occurred before anyone entered the cave, in planning rooms, in risk assessments that were never taken seriously enough, in the quiet assumption that enthusiasm could substitute for structure. Caves do not care about enthusiasm. They do not respect good intentions. They only respond to preparation. And on that March day in 1984, preparation had been the one thing missing.